Hello. Hi, everybody. My name is Dario Fazzi. I'm senior researcher at the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies. And today I'm here with my colleague, Cees Heere, who is postdoctoral researcher at the RIAS, and with the president of the National Association for American Studies here in the Netherlands, Professor George Blaustein, who is professor of American Studies,
I should not be called a professor. I'm geen hoogleraar, Dario.
Oh, okay. So that means like senior lecturer.
Yes.
Something like that. Oh, okay. But you work in Amsterdam, right, George? And you are based there in Amsterdam. Good. With George, we wanted to start today a series of conversations on the American elections, but actually the American elections are more of an excuse to talk about the United States with colleagues and experts who live and work in this country, in the Netherlands, accompanying us toward this deadline that we all have on November the 3rd. Hoping, of course, for the better, if the better exists. So what we want to do is actually to have really a honest, a clear, and also an informal conversation with colleagues about how things are going on in the United States. And for this, I would like to pass the ball to Cees, to my colleague, so that we can start our chat with George.
Yeah, thanks, Dario, and thanks for setting this up. George, let's just start with the obvious. You are an American teaching American studies in the Netherlands and following the upcoming elections, not from the United States itself, but from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. How do you think this kind of changes your perspective on what's going to unfold within the next few months?
That is, in a way, that's a question I've had to grapple with for all of the years that I've been here, where there's still, to be an American teaching American studies in Europe is to have to navigate sometimes surprising expectations from European students, where you have some students who, even if we are in more and more a kind of post-American world or a world of American decline, some students still look to the United States as something of a beacon. I think this was true in the Obama years. And somehow some students in the Netherlands still run on the fumes of that expectation. And this means that one of the roles or one of the predicaments of being an American scholar teaching American studies in the Netherlands is your job to some degree is to disillusion European students about America. That's one of the tasks. Then another task is, or a kind of parallel task, is those students who insist on the contrary narrative of constant American disaster, in which case your job becomes to articulate similarities between the Europe and the American case, to say, Europe is not exempt from the disasters that you are, or from the crimes that you are, that you are placing the United States at the center of. And those things are often at cross purposes, and I do not know how to navigate them. And then for the current moment, actually one of the problems is to design an American studies curriculum and interest students and to remind them that there is a kind of academic inquiry that is not about the election, to bring attention to things that are gloriously irrelevant to the dumpster fire of American politics or the tawdry, tragic goings-on. Those are three different answers to that question. But again, I'd be more interested in how you, as a non-American person teaching American studies, in a way, are freer of that predicament. But we can come back to that.
Can I ask you something related to this? Did you notice any difference in your students' attitude when Trump was elected between this glorification of the United States or mystification of it? Did you notice any relevant change?
Well, I'll answer that with an anecdote about the morning after the election, which was a strange day to teach American history. I believe I had this. I might be misremembering this. I had the survey course in American history, which I call American History Beginning to End, ridiculously. And I had been up, most of the night, a quite terrible night. And I came into the seminar in the morning, and I believe that the text on the syllabus was Rip Van Winkle. I always love assigning Rip Van Winkle, this kind of ridiculous there's an American story about a, Dutch community in New York, and it's about someone who sleeps through the American Revolution. So here's the story about somebody, falling asleep for 20 years and waking up in a changed world. I actually think it's a very funny story. It's also a very serious story. That was a more vivid story in a lot of ways, even though I was not myself entirely surprised by the election. I still experienced it, like most of us did, as it caused a kind of political grief that I didn't know I was capable of feeling. Anyway, I go into the room for the seminar room, and some of the students there were a few students who are, and we all have these kinds of students who are, political junkies, had followed the election with a kind of sports audience attention, and right away, and this was like 10 or 11 in the morning, I'm ill-slept, some of the students are ill-slept, some of these students right away had this kind of post-game analysis at the ready. Oh, well, obviously Hillary Clinton didn't campaign in Wisconsin. If she had spent a little more money here, then the polls would have gone this way, and Trump clearly had navigated this. They had this kind of sporting event post-game analysis informed by data journalism. They were clearly viewers of 538, of the New York Times Needle. They just had the kind of metrics. They had the kind of baseball metrics. They just knew these things. And they snapped immediately into that kind of sports post-game analysis without any sense of the real disaster. And I, as a teacher, had to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, let's think about this outside of that kind of horse race politics or that kind of horse race sports spectatorship, because in fact I found the enormity of it overwhelming. And to bring that back to the question, like there is a kind of in the Netherlands among the students and more broadly, a sense that it all is over there. There's an ironic distance from the disaster. And so it can be a spectacle, sometimes a terrible spectacle, but nevertheless a kind of remote spectacle, and at times a cartoon. And I think that some of the Dutch humor about the election reflects that. The one in 2017 that might be now forgotten. Do you remember that viral video of America first, Netherlands second, which set off a chain of European videos of that genre, where every country jokes about its racist features as a way of comically impressing Donald Trump. That, in a way, was a paradigmatic Dutch reaction, in my view, and there was a student version of it.
So students are still triggered by the United States, anyhow. Maybe
or they're not triggered, or they could see it as a kind of sporting event. Others, particularly students, and I'm sympathetic to this, those students who are interested in race and ethnicity and have a complicated identity relationship to the United States or to the countries in which they live, are more in the conventional current sense triggered or emotionally vulnerable to what happens in the United States. And those students that's also an interesting thing to navigate in the class, especially when American studies tend in this country to function as a kind of ethnicity studies or Black studies. So every classroom has those who are triggered and those who are not triggered.
Yeah, to me, the interesting thing is that if we go back like a couple of generations ago, maybe students of American studies were more protagonists of that cultural landscape than spectators, as students are. So the idea is that you can still look at the United States almost as a fetish than as your own cultural gems, and that's very, very interesting. Cees, do you?
Yeah, just wondering, just reflecting slightly on the way that teaching intersects with these developments in American history that we are witness to. Has the way that you change American history, American culture, changed at all during the past 4 years? Like how, of course, the history of the United States is a very different narrative if its destination, its telos, is the Obama years. It's a very different story whether Trump or Obama stands at the end of it.
Yes.
Has the way that you, maybe the texts that you assign or the way that you interpret those changed as a result of what happened in 2016?
Yes, in some ways yes, in some ways no. I still use it's such an interesting question, and I would love to gather answers to this question from teachers of American studies abroad. Let me think for a second how I want to organize this answer. Yes, how I approach these things do change, but not in the way that one did change, but not in the way that one might expect. I already had the way I framed American history in the Obama years was not in a kind of Whiggish arc toward an Obama style, heroic liberal internationalism, or however we want to call it. In fact, you had a sense in those Obama years of fragileness, strangeness, and things under the surface. So most of the the texts I had on my courses were already, there was plenty of attention to police violence, plenty of attention to structural racism in the American context, plenty of attention to, or not plenty, but attention to indigenous voices, all of these things, environmental change being the things that that the Obama administration did not really halt. And so some disillusionment at the end was built in already. And so in coming to the end of American history after Trump, I wanted to avoid I think among critical Americanists, the kind of standard canon of critical American studies at the moment, in the wake of Trump, there was a kind of wave of there's a wave of a kind of "told you so"ism, like a wave of a wave that see. Trump represents the kind of confirmation of these built-in structural features of American life around race and violence. So in that sense, Trump was not an exception to an American rule, but a kind of culmination. And then every outrage of the Trump era could then be greeted with an American studies interpretation that began with, of course this happened. Like there's therefore nothing surprising about there's nothing surprising about the Trump administration because the crimes were already baked into American history, and you could then recast American history with everything seeming Trump-like. Andrew Jackson is a kind of proto-Trump. Woodrow Wilson was also racist as hell. You kind of have the series of presidentiads that then seem like Trump is the logical endpoint. In a way, I wanted to risk that as well, because what becomes interesting in teaching the Trump era or ending an American history course in the Trump era is a kind of total unpredictability of this moment. Suddenly, predicting the future based on the past is very difficult. Or the students now, you have to make students think about historical uncertainty in a way that they, at least in Western Europe, would not have experienced, and were shielded from to some degree in the Obama years, at least in the West years. So it's you're teaching. Now I'm bringing myself to an answer. I'm sorry that I'm going on so long. Avoiding the kind of told you so-ism of American studies while acknowledging all the terribleness of Trump and Trumpism, but making students think about the uncertainty of historical processes is one of the things I realize that I am now doing in my teaching. I'm curious how you have handled this question.
In my case, I don't know if this is true for Cees as well, but in my case, what I noticed, perhaps as a reaction, to the unpredictability that Trump has brought about, was a sense, a feeling among students that even, rejecting all the structural violence, the contradictions that Trump has embodied, America, the United States, was still appealing among students, especially for what its society represented, for the feeling of societal change, of the possibility of that change, and the fluidity of American society that students here in Europe sometimes do not perceive as belonging to their own society. In the United States, it's relatively simpler to make your voice heard, organize, to take to the street, to bring about change, from Gonzalez and the student movements to the new Black Lives Matter. This is what students, at least in my courses, now seem to be interested in more than in unpredictability. How can we establish bridges of solidarity across the Atlantic?
Yeah, that's true. They are, like, now the wave of student identification is with an exported American protest model, or some kind of resistance, whether it's the genuine history of protest or the sometimes fluffier hashtag resistance that is now the norm. That becomes the kind of canonical American story. That's true, and the students do. It's worth remembering for our students, if they're 17 or 18 BA students, one of the generation defining experiences for them, or the way a kind of moment in which they enter a political consciousness, is participating in the Women's March on January 21st. So many of our Dutch students have gone to that thing, and that becomes the kind of common supranational movement consciousness, and that is interesting. And I don't know whether to call it predictable or unpredictable, but that is a feature of pedagogy now.
Can I ask another question, Cees, or you have one?
Go for it, Dario.
You should also, if I'm rambling on too long and you want to say, shut up, I have other questions, or you're not making any sense, edit me.
No, this is perfect. No, but we are going toward the end. I mean, I may have one final question on my behalf, because exactly against this backdrop of change, of structural violence that we need to cope with, of fluidity of American society, how do you see Biden as a candidate? I mean, you wrote a beautiful piece that was called The Audacity of Grief. But besides grieving, besides the personal story, besides the ideology and the political centrism, do you think that in 4 years' time, when we will hopefully talk about Biden's era, will that be similar to this one or completely different? Will the dust settle down, or will this societal change keep going on and completely transform America?
I really have no idea. I have no idea how to answer this question, of course, but I'll try to say something about Biden, and I know some reflection on this. I mean, I'm more of a literary and cultural historian. My own politics, probably predictably, are democratic socialist. I wanted Bernie Sanders very much, even though I also am skeptical that a President Bernie Sanders would have achieved what I wanted a President Bernie Sanders to achieve, because the forces of capital were allied so resolutely against him in a way that I think is frankly quite bald. I mean, think of the billionaire candidates who joined the Democratic election and now have not spoken at all. Now that Bernie is no longer president, nobody, the CEO of Starbucks has not uttered a single statement. His task is done. He has squashed the insurgence of Bernie Sanders. Bloomberg the same. Okay, so that, in a way, that drama is done. And then what of the figure of Joe Biden? I wrote this essay about Biden and grief because I think Biden is the ideology of Biden, whatever that is not all that interesting. The interesting thing about Biden is he's actually one of these American politicians who lends himself to something like a literary analysis, who lends himself to something like you can read Biden's life and the chords he plays in the culture the way you would read a novel. And the theme and the mythology of grief are central to that. And so Biden is actually quite unique. So I wanted to describe that. But ideologically speaking, I think the sentence I wrote that I still think is true is that Biden has, looking over Biden's 40 years in politics, whether it's busing, policing, war in Iraq, new Democrat Clintonian neoliberal policies, Biden is not a visionary. He has indexed rather than transcended the political tensions of his time. He's never had a genuine vision of the future that is original or visionary, for better or worse. He's kind of a pragmatic politician. He's just a dude. He wants to be president, and his primary vector of political appeal is emotional rather than structural. In a way, that makes it possible for a kind of progressive Biden administration with him as just the doddering figurehead who is more and more visibly aged and less articulate and less fluent. I don't particularly care about the figure of the president as a person. I actually think I'm so annoyed at the inflatedness of the president as a kind of monarch and a sort of romantic identity figure and a sort of statesman and a sort of commander-in-chief. All these things are so much of them are bullshit, and I want to deflate them. So if behind the doddering figure of Biden, there are some structural changes that would, in a way, be out of the public view. They would be not particularly, they wouldn't be this kind of constant stream of, it wouldn't be a feed of news, either good or bad. I would want a more, just a soberer, but nevertheless, progressive politics. That would be very different and would come as some kind of relief. That long description is the most optimistic thing I can say about Biden, I would say.
I think that this could have been applied also to FDR in 1932.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. A figure who was so frustrating to the left. Yeah.
There was Cees who wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you, George. I enjoyed that essay. It reminded me somewhat of another article which I had read earlier, but I've now discovered has been written later, which was a piece by Fintan O'Toole in the New York Review of Books, who makes a similar argument about these kind of the intimate connections, Biden as a channeler for a nation in mourning. Who allows himself to become this kind of vehicle for a grieving America. And in the end, he sort of comes to the conclusion that, in a sense, both Biden and, of course, Donald Trump have this sort of quality of nostalgia, of grieving. Just do it in a sense. They represent kind of different stages of grief, right? Trump never left anger. Whereas Biden represents, I suppose, a more advanced state of mourning. And he concludes that essay with a rather pithy question whether Biden's politics of grief is really adequate to Trump's politics of grievance.
Yes.
Whether that kind of longing and nostalgia for a sort of undefined past in when things weren't quite so a yearning for something that's been lost, even if we can't quite define what that thing has been. But does that really stand a chance against the sort of forces that Trump has been able to marshal to his side rhetorically?
Yeah, I really liked that essay by Fintan O'Toole, which was it was written, I think, it was written a few months after the one I wrote, and I really admired it. It also I would land on the same question. I think both of those essays, both my essay and the Fintan O'Toole essay, were written before the pandemic. Am I right about that? Did the Fintan? Yeah. And so when I wrote that essay, and I think the O'Toole essay is similar in this, the liberal grief was, there's the grief of liberals and the grievance of the right. The left, to some degree, is left out of both of these essays a little bit, but it was the grief felt by American liberalism in 2016 that was the thing that Biden was trying to challenge, and I was dubious. I was skeptical in April of last year that an appeal to this kind of liberal grief would succeed. It seemed like it would not actually answer or counterbalance the power of Trumpist grievance or the genuine, like, working class suspicion of a kind of liberal rhetoric in America, which has been so revealed as inadequate to my mind, and yet there is a kind of it feels almost like a kind of destiny to have Biden's politics of grief resonate in the way that it seems to be resonating now in the pandemic, where the Trumpist grievance that is unable to articulate any kind of empathetic grief now seems deeply unattractive, while Biden, though he doesn't have the political sharpness and rhetorical mastery, nevertheless emerges as a kind of mourner-in-chief, or in Dutch, trooster-in-chief, or kind of comforter-in-chief. So in that sense, in ways that I think would have been quite hard to predict or unimaginable, the Trumpist grief, or the Bidenite articulation of grief, now does resonate in a way that it would not have a year ago. But again, we don't know. What do you think? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen, Cees? Tell me what's going to happen.
I wish I did. It's the worst question to ask a historian.
I know.
People always seem to come to us looking for answers, and the only thing we can really, if you want answers, you go to a social scientist, right? If you want predictions,
but they can't answer. Yeah,
I think
they can't answer. They can't answer anything.
No, we care too much about the quality of our predictions to really make any.
Yeah, but I do think. But I mean, basically, I've just restated your question in the form of a sentence. I think that axis of grief and grievance is in a way the pivotal national one, and we don't know.
Yeah, perhaps that question might be in a sense stated in a somewhat different form, which is, I suppose, we still haven't quite figured out yet what the sort of the overarching theme or narrative of this election is going to be. Is it indeed going to be the pandemic election, where the central feature will be Trump's handling of the pandemic, 200,000 Americans who have died as a result of it? Or is it going to be an election fundamentally about questions of American identity, about race in American society, which seems to be the angle that Trump himself is tilting towards? It really seems to sort of vary by news cycle.
Yeah.
And it's not until we get a little bit further along in the campaigns that we really get a sense of how certainly the Democratic camp intends to kind of steer this election, or whether they intend to steer it at all towards one particular issue.
Yeah, I think that I have two things come to mind with that. On one hand, there's the way you put that question is, which strategy have the parties chosen? It seems like the Democratic Party has chosen the if it is a lane, it has chosen the kind of identity lane and the incompetence of Trump lane. But for the historian, if we're looking back on this from the future, if there is a future, those lanes, those strategic lanes chosen by the parties will not actually illuminate the reality. The reality will be messier. And so, for example, because true disasters have 1,000 causes, and all things have 1,000 causes, but in retrospect, I can think about the 2016 election. I've wanted to go back to some of the commentary about opioid addiction in 2015 and 2016. That actually, in the regions that Trump did surprisingly well in, the kind of opioid epidemic, if that's the right word for it, was in fact a curiously decisive phenomenon in particular regions of the U.S. that nobody talked about during the election, but that was for those regions a kind of symbol or synecdoche of the social breakdown that might make someone look to Trump for relief or salvation. And so retrospectively, one of the 1,000 causes or one of the 1,000 causes in 2016 was that phenomenon. Now, actually detailing what the chain of causation is between opioid addiction and Trump election is hard and kind of impossible. But the point I would want to make is that, what the chain of causation from 180,000 people dying, which is a kind of undeniable, incontrovertible social disaster that has to have some kind of impact, unmanageable by both of the parties. The Republican Party, for all its rhetoric, can't actually erase that from the experiences of hundreds of thousands of American people. They can kind of direct it in some way. It's no good. Like I actually think Trump could very likely win this election. Even if he wins this election, the impact of 180,000 people dying will be in the chain of causation somehow. But I'm looking to analogies to that kind of causation, and opioid addiction in 2016 is interesting to me as a template for the present. Even though it's not it's apples and oranges in some way, but I think it's very hard to say, okay, what is the concrete historical cause and effect chain from the pandemic to the election. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I wonder if any of that lands.
Yeah, no, it's very striking to me how difficult will be to especially teach about these elections in the future, because if we draw analogies, especially with the past, there's always a factual event that we can, in a way, connect or try to reconnect to the field of politics, the realm of politics, whereas nowadays everything seems personalized. It's not about politics anymore. It's about the inefficiency of Trump as a political persona versus the magnificence of Trump in the Trumpist rhetoric as a political persona. So it's the disappearance itself of politics that can be, perhaps it's the trickiest terrain for the Democratic Party at the moment.
Do you ever look at Fox News?
We are recorded, so it's something I don't want to disclose now. Yes, sometimes I do, but with the eye of the anthropologist.
Yeah, no, similarly, I do as well. I mean, I my own diet of news is, pretty unsystematic and idiosyncratic, and I sometimes have to look away from all of it. But it really is another world to look at just even from the Netherlands, to look at the Fox News front page. And I don't have anything to say about it except the obvious thing that it is quite another world. And the way the coronavirus is covered on Fox News is really, it is quite strange. I wish I had I wish I was fluent enough in European news outlets to see if there was an analog in Western Europe.
I'm sure in Russia or Belarus.
Yeah.
Maybe they have something like Fox News. That's true. But would you use it as a teaching tool, for instance, exporting your students to Fox News just to give them a glimpse of what conservative America looks like at the moment?
I probably wouldn't, just because. But what I would want to do is, and I try to do this in my teaching, I do try to find, interesting conservative commentary to surprise, because I in the Netherlands in particular, or at least in Amsterdam, where there is a kind of default, almost smug pseudo left liberalism among the population, to present student with to for example, make students read intellectual conservative magazines, show students articles from First Things, for example, the evangelical Catholic little magazine that I don't agree with myself, but nevertheless has some serious thinkers, or at least the kind of serious version of conservative ideas, or to make them read, conservative thought in the 20th century. You make them read George Schuyler, the great black conservative, the kind of great contrarian novelist and intellectual in the 20th century, and to make them read some serious religious thinkers about this, which of course could backfire and seem like my own defense of conservatism. But all of the Fox News stuff to some degree is on the surface. It's not a text that requires much in the way of interpretation, I think, at this point.
Well, George, unless Cees has something else to ask. Cees, do you?
No, just a brief observation on the alternative reality that Fox News presents, right? I suppose it will be one of the questions that we'll see answered within the next few months, is whether that alternative reality constructed inside the right-wing media bubble of Trump as this sort of omnipotent commander-in-chief will stand up to, I suppose, the reality of rising COVID infections exactly in those regions from which Trump himself has drawn electoral support. I suppose the point to make is that it is hard to make this kind of insurgent, anti-governmental, anti-Washington campaign when you are yourself at least nominally in charge of the show. Whatever your politics are, I think there is something tricky about making the argument that you are, on the one hand, this kind of omnipotent figure who is on the other hand constantly being frustrated and waylaid by internal opposition. There's something about the way that Trump presents himself as president that doesn't really quite work in that way. I suppose it's one of the things that we will, and it doubtlessly statisticians will unleash countless analyses on the degree to whether a particular county has been affected by the degree to which it's been affected by COVID, whether at all that translates into some form of political swing. It's, I mean, not my personal area of expertise, but I do see, which brings us full circle to exactly the sort of horse racing analyses, politics of as a sporting event that you warned us against in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, considering how he escaped the whole impeachment thing, I would not be surprised to see anything counterintuitive happening.
Well, there is a crucial difference, I think, with the Russia scandal and the impeachment trials, which is that the Russia scandal, even if you were a political junkie, the details of it were somewhat arcane. I think the number of people who've actually, I mean, George, you probably did read the Mueller report cover to cover, or maybe a condensed version of course. But I seriously doubt that a lot of Midwestern voters did the same. Whereas the effects of lockdown or the effects of a relative dying prematurely or being landed in the ICU because of the pandemic are something that do impact on someone's lived reality, and how that's interpreted and whether that it is indeed enough to sort of puncture the filter bubble is, I think, something that remains very much to be seen.
Exactly. And that's, because that's concrete. I mean, that is concrete in a way that, the Russia scandal, and it's totally unsurprising to me that the impeachment failed. It was also totally unsurprising to me that the Mueller investigation went out with a whimper. Totally unsurprising to me that Trump could withstand such things, and it seemed more like a feature of, I hate this phrase, mainstream media, so I'll use something like legacy media. It was a kind of, there was quite a lot of projection, a kind of fantasy of projection onto Russia as the cause of American political woes. And so this fantasy that there would be some kind of rescue by Mueller or figures like Mueller, and the displacement of responsibility for American political disaster onto Russia. Now, of course, I think there is interference. Absolutely. I also think at the same time, the fantasy that American elections have ever been sacred was a story that the American center, that American liberals could tell themselves, but that was never going to succeed. And now it's a farce that became a tragedy. Now is a moment when the manifest, like, this is like, the Trump reaction to the pandemic is a genuinely incompetent, impeachable thing, manifestly so, with 180,000 deaths, and yet such is a kind of American politics and the spinelessness of most of the people in electoral power, that now impeachment is not possible because it was already the gun was already fired and didn't land, so they can't do it again. So now we're in this situation where the all rests on the election, and that makes me quite pessimistic. But again, the corona is concrete in a way that the Russia scandal was not, even though there was a scandal.
Yeah, well, I see the manipulation of reality as concrete now with the Russian with the Russian scandal. That's true. I mean, seen from the perspective of those Fox News commentators we were talking about before. But okay, George, I really want to thank you a lot for this. We in the end talked for almost 1 hour. So
and as expected. You guys were both more lucid and illuminating than I.
No, it's been a great pleasure. So I wanted to thank you on behalf of the whole RIAS, on behalf of NASA, for starting this off, and I hope to see you soon. Okay.
See you soon.
Bye, man.
Bye, George.
Bye, Cees. Bye, Dario.